Okay, it's 3 minutes past the hour. I think we can get started. Thank you, everybody, for signing in. My name is Scott Bellis. I'm a counselor for the BC Yukon region, and I'm also the current council president of your association. Thanks for being here. Today's discussion is a very important one. There's a lot of changes happening in our industry now and over the last few years. And I think now that more than ever, it's important that we can communicate about how those changes have been affecting us and also our mental well-being. We know that on the National Council, we see a lot of communication from members about the importance of the issues surrounding mental health and well-being. So it's great that we're having this webinar today. Before we begin our Q&A on mental health, I'm going to offer a land acknowledgement and Equity's statement of affirmation. So I'm coming to you from Vancouver, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish Nation, the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and the Musqueam people. These people of the Salish Sea have made their homes in this area for thousands of years, and their relationship to the lands and waters of this region is ongoing to this very day. In fact, I've got a link that I just want to share in the chat here. So Tsleil-Waututh First Nations just completed a whole bunch of water restoration projects in Burrard Inlet. And you can read about some of those things by clicking on that link if you're curious. You can follow all the news of the people of the inlet. Okay, Equity's statement of affirmation goes like this. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity further recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. We would like to gratefully acknowledge the Government of Canada and the Department of Canadian Heritage as part of the Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund for the funding of this session and all of the seminars and workshops that we've been able to deliver over the past few months. After this workshop, we will also be sending all of you a link to complete a brief survey, as we are really looking forward to feedback from you on the workshops that we're presenting. So we have some guidance on how to move forward with these in the future. Okay, as usual, in these sessions, I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section or use the raise hand option, as any questions that you put into the chat may get lost in the conversation that happens there. All right, now I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Matt Eldridge. Hey, Matt, welcome. Matt is a registered social worker, having completed a Master of Social Work degree in 2013. He currently works full-time in a private practice. His previous work experience includes being the coordinator psychotherapist of the Al and Malka Green Artists Health Center, a clinic specifically for arts and cultural workers. And prior to becoming a social worker, Matt performed as an acrobat in the Cirque du Soleil production of Dralion. Incredible. Very impressive. Now I'd like to hand things over to our moderator today, performer and council member for the Quebec region, and awesome counselor colleague of mine, Deena Aziz. Away to you, Matt and Deena. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. And we're so glad, Matt, that you can be with us here today. I'm just going to take a second to explain the structure of the session. And while I'm doing that, if you like, plop into the chat where you're Zooming from. And if you like, plop into the chat how you're doing today. A word that kind of expresses how your mind is or your body is or your spirit. The session is going to be in two parts. The first part of the session is going to be more, first part loosely, a presentation from Matt, and he's going to share a lot of ideas and information and tools addressing mental health. This part of the session will be recorded and made available later on the website. You can choose to keep your camera off, and please stay muted for that section. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, you can either hang on to them or put them into the Q&A, and we will address them either as they come if they relate to the presentation, or hang on to them for the second part, which is going to be more interactive, and we'll invite you to pose your questions, unmute, and bring you into the conversation, and we'll look at some of the more specific questions or ideas you have around mental health. This part of the session will not be recorded, just so you know. And then if we have time, we will have Matt lead us in a guided meditation, which would be lovely if we can squeeze that in. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Matt, to do some introduction and overview.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. So like everyone said, my name is Matt, and I'm a social worker and psychotherapist and a former arts worker with a background in circus and theater. I do have a PowerPoint presentation available that I'll go through, just talking about mental health, talking about skills and strategies to take care of our mental health. I do like it to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or comments that come up along the way, certainly feel free to throw them into the chat, or to unmute or turn your camera on, and certainly feel free to communicate them that way. And like Deena said, we'll certainly reserve some time at the end for very specific questions and comments that you might have. But yeah, I guess I'll just sort of dive right into it. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation. Does that look good? Everybody see that? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So just sort of some of the things that we potentially can talk about today are what leads to symptoms of anxiety and depression. I can talk a little bit about my own experiences with mental health, well, specifically while I was on tour with Cirque du Soleil. We can certainly talk about mental health skills. We can talk about things that make us vulnerable to things like anxiety and depression. We can talk about relationships and how that impacts our experiences with our mental health. And we can go over some resources as well that you might be able to access to take care of your own personal mental health. And so, like, talking about mental health is important, and it can also be potentially difficult. So just as we go along, I'll encourage you just to check in with yourselves and to just continue to practice grounding, which means trying to stay as present as possible. So bringing your awareness to your breath, bringing your awareness to your five senses, and certainly distract yourself away or take a break if that's just something that you feel like you need. So to start off, I often like to use what's called the biosocial model of mental health to describe what can contribute to emotion dysregulation, powerful emotions, anxiety, and depression. So according to the biosocial model, we say that genetic vulnerability, so our genes, what's in our genes, what's just naturally inherited to us, plus invalidating environments or invalidating experiences can lead to emotion dysregulation. And invalidating environments or experiences can look like a lot of different things. So some examples that I've offered here are like putting out a really vulnerable piece of work and being criticized for it, being taken advantage of in any kind of way, never being good enough to someone in a position of power, feeling like you have no control, not being able to afford the cost of living, not winning an audition, So like artists in particular are at a greater risk for experiencing invalidating experiences. One thing that I really want to stress is the vulnerability aspect of things. Like to be an artist is just inherently a really vulnerable thing. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in any kind of way, to experience validation is a very important thing. And so often we experience invalidation when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And that in turn can really affect our mood and our experiences with anxiety. So like, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own experiences with Cirque du Soleil. So these are just some pictures from my time there. As you can see in the bottom right corner, I'm missing a tooth. So the way that this act was set up was we were starting on top of that wall that you can see in the bottom left and the top right corner. And we dropped off the top of it onto the trampoline on purpose. And then we were meant to kick our way back up to the top of the wall. And in training, I slipped and fell. And luckily for me, the only physical injury that I suffered was knocking that tooth out. But mentally, it was a pretty traumatizing experience to have gone through. And so there were multiple experiences of invalidation that I personally experienced when I was there. So one example was that traumatic fall. Like it was invalidating to my mind and body because it was just a very unsafe, stressful experience. From there were a lot of really high expectations of me compared to where I was at with my training. And so what I mean by that is that I was struggling to keep up with the expectations of my colleagues and of my management. And then in turn, there was quite a bit of relational conflict. We were having a hard time getting along with each other, and I became quite emotionally dysregulated, which in turn affected my performance, which in turn led to more invalidation and more conflict with the team. So it ended up being a pretty challenging experience, which absolutely had an impact over my mental health. And then just a little bit about what I did that didn't particularly help me. I did a pretty good job of hiding my struggles from most people, which was not a good thing. I certainly had a habit of like just putting a smile on my face, trying to put a brave face forward, even though I was really struggling internally. I really thought I was trapped in the situation. I didn't know that there were solutions to help me in the moment. I worried a lot, and I spent a lot of time in bed. I would pretty much stay until the last possible second before running out the door to hop on the bus to get to the arena to perform. But like I definitely spent just as much time in bed trying to avoid the situation really as much as possible. So these were sort of the things that I did that didn't particularly help me, maybe even made things worse. But I certainly did things that did help. And first and foremost, around the concept of validation, I really tried to keep in touch with friends and family, supportive people as much as I could at home. I was able to speak with a sports psychologist over Skype, which was incredibly useful. He was a major source of validation for me, which was really important. And thankfully, I had a pretty supportive coach, and he was able to offer the extra support that I needed. Because I was really just struggling completely on my own, and I really needed extra help to help me to train and to perform. And then in terms of the skills, so like when it comes to supporting our mental health, it's important that there's a balance of validation with mental health skills. And so some of the things that I was able to do to help to take care of myself were to focus on aspects of the tour that I did like. Another way that I like to frame that is sort of practicing gratitude, like being grateful for some things that I did have that I did appreciate. Breathing, which I always like to see that note because I'm always a little bit anxious at the beginning of these presentations. So it's a good reminder to help myself to breathe in this moment. But I have a very clear recollection of the sports psychologist telling me to breathe, and it being somewhat of an aha moment because I actually didn't realize how much I was holding my breath, taking shorter, shallow breaths. And as simple as it sounds, one of the most important things we can do to help to take care of ourselves is to focus on our breathing. I would do my best to take advantage of time off, like trying to find something that I enjoyed in every city that I went to. Another way of saying that is I sort of worked on accumulating positive experiences, like to help to regulate our emotions. It's a good thing to very conscientiously try to accumulate positive experiences. I tried to keep myself in as good shape as possible. Like the better I was at the act, the more mentally well I felt. What I mean by practicing cognitive strategies was trying to be mindful over the catastrophizing I was doing. Like I was really worried that I was going to make the same mistake again and hurt myself again. And I had to reframe the thoughts to remind myself that as long as I'm staying focused and grounded, everything was okay. And then in turn, I had to practice grounding. So what I specifically mean by that is that because it was so stressful and scary for me, I would essentially dissociate. Like my mind and body would kind of mentally check out, and that was dangerous for the act. And so I really had to focus on keeping my mind and body present by paying attention to my breath, paying attention to my 5 senses, and with the act very specifically, really reminding myself to feel my foot on the wall, notice how that feels in my leg, and just keep myself there as much as possible. Yeah, so maybe I'll just take a quick break here and just see if there's any questions or comments about validation, invalidating environments, or just about any part of my experience that I shared there. Yeah, and Deena, certainly if anything comes to mind for you, certainly feel free to let us know.
Oh, somebody would like to see the first slide again.
Sure.
If you can run it back.
This one?
Mandy, is that what you're looking for? Yep. When you talk about catastrophizing, Matt, I really feel like performers in general are kind of master's, graduate level when it comes to catastrophizing, because there's so many unknowns in what we do, and there's so little, seemingly little control. I know you're going to talk about this probably more as we go on, but can you say anything about how that sense of not having control over the things that will dictate your work and your life and your future, how do we reconcile that?
Yeah, this is maybe a bit of a vague response, but like finding ways in which you can access your own control is something that's really important. Like it is very important for our mental health to feel like we have a sense of control. And so just sort of reflecting on what is actually within your control here. Actually, this reminds me of something I saw recently. I was watching the Jennifer Hudson show, and an actor, I don't know the name of her, I don't know her name off the top of my head. But I thought she made a really great point. Like she was talking about her experiences before making her big break, and she was saying that stand-up was something that brought her a sense of control, because that was an area where she could say whatever she wanted to, she could perform when she wanted to, and like it wasn't in the hands of somebody else to sort of limit what she said or when she performed. And I thought actually that was a really great example of somebody finding a way in which she could access control in a field in which there often is little control.
Yeah, it's a tricky one when you feel like you're waiting for someone to let you do the thing you want to do.
Yeah.
Could you define a little and elaborate on dysregulation, emotional dysregulation? There's a question about that as a new term.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what I mean by that is a powerful emotion, like an emotion that doesn't feel regulated. There's a term or a concept that I really like called the window of tolerance, and everybody has a window of tolerance. What that means is this sort of space where we're feeling things and we're feeling them in a regulated way. So like you can feel happy, sad, anxious, guilty, jealous. You can feel anything, but you feel sort of a sense of control and regulation around those feelings. Sometimes life can be so stressful for us that it takes us outside of our window of tolerance. And that's where the emotion is dysregulated. So not regulated, not within sort of a sense of control. And on the upper end of the spectrum, we can feel what we call a hyper arousal, which is a flooding of emotion. And on the lower end of the spectrum, we can feel what we call a hypo arousal, which is more of a shutdown response. And so sort of in general, like being mindful of our window of tolerance and doing the best that we can to keep ourselves in our window is a really important thing for our mental health. It does happen for sure to all of us where life can take us outside of our window and we can feel that flood of emotion or we can feel that shutdown. When that happens, it sometimes takes a bit longer to recover from those experiences.
Mhm.
But I guess ultimately what I mean by emotion dysregulation is we've fallen outside of our window of tolerance and we're feeling overwhelmed or shut down.
So it's not about what the emotion is or whether or not it's appropriate. It's about the level of tolerance and manageability.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
A question about the relationship issues you mentioned with your experience on Dralion, and that team members made it hard. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, like we were from all over the world, and so like one of the tough things was there were real cultural differences in terms of how we communicated to one another. So like unfortunately I was literally insulted. Like sometimes they would say to me, "You're too weak, you need to be stronger, you need to prove to us that you're a man." And I'd be like, "We don't talk to each other in Canada like that."
Oh my God.
It was stressful because we would literally get into arguments with each other. And I at the time had a really hard time with assertiveness and was sort of speaking up for myself. And oftentimes I would just kind of shut down when faced with that type of criticism, that type of conflict. And so in retrospect, it certainly would have been useful for me to have learned the interpersonal skills or tried to utilize the interpersonal skills to try to make the team a little bit of a healthier environment. But that's literally what I was talking about. Like I would literally be insulted.
Right.
Understandably, so it was not good for my mental health.
Sort of not your job to fix that, but
Yeah,
did you get?
like that, like it certainly speaks to systemic issues around what's sort of seen as acceptable in terms of communication in the workplace. Like I don't know how things are now, but for sure at that point it was tolerated that people spoke to each other like that.
Okay. Those are the questions for now.
Okay, great. And maybe if it's okay, Deena, is it okay if you kept an eye on time for me too and just like gave me
Sure.
like some time checks? Because like
Mhm.
I absolutely can sort of get carried away with talking and I might lose track of time. So it's okay. It would be great if you could give me just like 30, 20, 10-minute to
Okay.
yeah, great. Thanks. Okay, so why don't we get into the skills portion of things? I think if I were to encourage you to take away anything from this conversation, it would be to really try to incorporate the skill of self-compassion into your life. Self-compassion sometimes is not an easy thing to practice, but it really is one of the most important skills that we can try to incorporate into our lives to help to take care of ourselves. So there is a science to self-compassion. According to the science of self-compassion, we say it comprises 3 parts. The first is mindfulness. So what that means is being present and non-judgmental with our present moment experience. The second is connection to humanity, which means reminding ourselves that we're not alone in our experiences. And the last part is kindness to self. So if I were to give you an example of how we could use this skill, I could use my current anxiety about presenting to everyone. So like if I was to not be compassionate towards myself, I would be judging myself, beating myself up for the way that I'm feeling. And so to practice the mindfulness component, I would say, I'm anxious. And that's it. Like just sort of being mindful over the feeling in an accepting and non-judgmental way. The connection to humanity part would be to say something like, I'm anxious, and that's human. Like this is a very normal human experience. Other people in this position would feel the exact same way. And then the kindness to self part essentially is like using kind words, like it's okay to feel this way. May I have the compassion that I need for myself in this moment. Or you could do a loving kindness meditation, which I might not do right now, just sort of in the interest of time. But the words of the loving kindness meditation are, may I be filled with loving kindness, may I be held in loving kindness, may I feel connected and calm, may I accept myself just as I am, may I be happy, may I know the natural joy of being alive. So it's really just kind of offering yourself kind words. I actually do find that to be particularly useful. I find that I naturally gravitate towards it if I'm feeling stressed. Like I always do it when I'm in the dentist chair. Like I hate going to the dentist, and like I'm always just sort of repeating these words of loving kindness. I was sort of saying them to myself before coming into this presentation as well. And like, this is a skill that we can really try to bring in if we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed in any kind of way. Like we can often invalidate ourselves for the way that we're feeling by judging or beating ourselves up for them. And so it's a really important thing to try to respond to ourselves with kindness and compassion, and breaking it down into these three components can often be a really useful thing. Like we can certainly offer ourselves compassionate body language, like holding our hands to our heart or just sort of gently caressing our arms. Again, there's sort of more words that you can offer yourself, like suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to this, may I be kind to myself in this moment, may I give myself the compassion I need, or literally asking yourself, what's a compassionate thing I can do for myself right now? I really like to offer people the concept of the vulnerability hangover. I think it's a really important thing for sure when it comes to the arts. Like when we really allow ourselves to be vulnerable, it is relatively common to feel somewhat hungover afterwards. Like I definitely feel that way after presentations. I can feel sort of exhausted. And I might worry a little bit about like, did I make a mistake or did I say something stupid? And like it can be useful to literally treat yourself as if you're sort of recovering from a hangover. Like I like to lie down on the couch and I like to just sort of take some deep breaths, and I like to practice a loving kindness meditation or some of the self-compassion, self-talk, or just sort of do something kind for myself, like have some good food or watch a funny YouTube video. Like it's a normal thing to feel somewhat hungover after we allow ourselves to be really vulnerable, and to help to cure that, a really important antidote is to practice self-compassion. An acronym that might be useful to keep in mind is REGAIN. So this is around like validating ourselves and again offering ourselves self-compassion. Like just to break it down, it stands for recognize, ground, allow, investigate, and normalize. So recognize, essentially what that means is it's important to recognize how we're feeling. Like I'm feeling anxious. Ground ourselves by paying attention to the breath, paying attention to the five senses. Allow means if it's okay, if it's tolerable, allow the feeling to come and go. And then investigate is one of the more helpful parts. Like sometimes we feel, or sometimes we feel a certain feeling and don't really know where it came from necessarily. And so it can be a helpful thing if manageable to spend a little bit of time investigating why did I feel that way? And then normalize means like just sort of remind ourselves that it's normal to feel this way and to not beat ourselves up about it. A quick example I can give you around this tool is I went camping several years ago for the first time in my life, and I was pretty excited about going. And then when I arrived at the campsite, I was caught off guard by this overwhelming feeling of sadness, and it made no sense to me in the moment, but I decided that I would try to regain. And when I did the investigate, I started thinking, in the not too distant past, I had a breakup with somebody who was quite outdoorsy. And I don't know if this is necessarily why I felt sad, but when I thought that to myself, I was able to say, I'm sad. And that makes sense because I just went through this painful experience and maybe this is reminding me of it. And that's a very normal response to this situation. And in turn, by offering myself that type of validation and compassion, I was able to soothe myself. Like validation and compassion is soothing to our emotions. And like after going through this process, I was able to be a lot more present with my friends because like I was able to just kind of normalize and soothe and validate the sadness that I was experiencing. Cool. So maybe I'll pause just again quickly just to see if there's any questions or comments about any of that, like about validation or compassion.
No questions at the moment.
No. Am I still sharing my screen?
Not at the moment.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. But this one is always an interesting one for conversation. I'm always curious what people think about the inner critic. If it's okay, Deena, I might put you on the spot again and just check in with you about your thoughts about the inner critic, about your own experiences with it, about just maybe.
Oh, I have no experience of that. Oh my God, no, it's ever present. I'm intrigued by the investigate part of your game because I think personally I have a tendency to clock the emotion, whatever it might be, and go, chill, it's okay. You're just feeling that and it's okay to feel that. Mm-hmm. And I think I often don't take the step of, okay, where's that coming from? Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which would probably be really helpful.
Yeah, it can be in like according to this type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. We say that there's sort of levels of validation, and like one level is to just sort of be mindful and present with our feelings, like what you're saying, like, okay, I'm going to clock this feeling, just going to notice it. And it's, according to this type of therapy, sort of a higher level of validation to be able to say, this is what I'm feeling, and this is why I'm feeling it. Like, this is a very normal response based on my experiences. And I guess just using this sort of model or framework, it could potentially be an even more soothing or validating experience to be able to identify like what is the reason for why I'm feeling this way, and in turn, like it's okay to feel this way. It's normal based on my experiences.
The inner critic is can be a real challenge because I think for a lot of people, it seems as though there may be many external factors contributing to criticism. That, it can feel like we're in competition for work. It can feel like we're in competition with ourselves for advancing in our career in some way. It can feel like, audiences are going to be judgmental and that actual critics might have something negative to say that will be distressing.
Totally. Yeah, no, there's lots of reasons for why we might experience inner criticism. For like when I was in Cirque du Soleil, if I saw a negative review written about us, I would be like mortified and really upset about it. Like, you put a lot of time and effort and vulnerability into these performances, and for somebody to say negative things about it, it could be a really hard thing to tolerate.
Yeah. And then of course there are people in the workplace who are not great at the supportive feedback, and it ends up being couched as criticism, and then that gets internalized and replayed again and again. Right.
Yeah. So from sort of that angle, I would definitely encourage the use of validating statements towards the performers. to try to soothe and also to be able to open the mind up to constructive feedback and constructive criticism. Like oftentimes when we balance validation and change, that can be a more effective route. Because if we sort of just go towards the change, it can really, like it can be tough to tolerate for a person. And so to be able to even open oneself up to experience some validation and soothing just can help to open the mind up to change.
It's a bit like yes and sort of.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like in dialectical behavior therapy, we're really encouraged to never use the word but to use the word and all the time. Like I understand this experience, like this makes so much sense to me. And at the same time, why don't we try this? Or why don't we move towards this type of change?
Great.
Yeah. But with the inner critic, I'm always curious about it because like people can have different thoughts about it. Like sometimes people think they need that inner critic in order to stay motivated or in order to achieve the best performance that they're potentially able to have. Some people don't really see very much value in it at all. Some people sort of see a balance between the two. But what I might encourage you to do is to sort of reflect on your experience with the inner critic and to maybe weigh the pros and cons of keeping it versus the pros and cons of letting it go. And it can also be useful to experiment with it. So like maybe over a 2-week period, have a kind day and then a business as usual day. So if you find yourself really self-critical on day 1, try a kind day, a compassionate day. Like it doesn't have to be unrealistically positive, but like it could be maybe just using the self-compassion skill or trying to be a bit kinder to yourself in general. And then day 2 can be just sort of a regular self-critical day, if that's something that you experience a lot of. And then day 3 can be the kind day, and day 4 can be the self-critical day. And then just kind of over time, just using that as data to decide what makes the most sense for you. Like, is it more effective for you to be critical towards yourself, or is it more effective to be compassionate? Or is there sort of a middle ground that we might want to find? And then just the last thing that I want to mention is around this is that self-compassion is a skill. And the more that you work on it, the better that you can get at it. It might not necessarily be easy at first, but the more sort of intentional practice we can get with self-compassion, the more that it can naturally come to us. Yeah, so the next sort of, I guess, bucket of skills that I want to go over is from what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is a skills-oriented type of therapy, and this is the model of it. So we say that your thoughts, your emotions, and your behaviors all interact with one another. So the way you think impacts the way you feel impacts the way you think, and all of that is impacted by our behaviors. So an example that I can give here is like you had a very tough meeting. That night you begin to think I'll be fired, or I'm not good enough, or I'll never be able to measure up to their standards. The thoughts start to make you feel sad. And instead of going to the gym, maybe you decide to order a pizza and go to bed early. And then maybe the next day you call in sick and stay in bed, and you're still feeling sad. And so according to this model, what we want to try to do is to make shifts with our behaviors and make shifts with the way that we think to in turn help with the way that we feel. So in the same situation, but different behavior here, this person, instead of ordering the pizza, did go to the gym. The distraction helped those negative thoughts. And after the workout, this person thinks, well, tomorrow is a new day and I will try my best to add my boss's suggestions to my project. And that night you go to bed, get a good night's rest, and feel more energized. So it's just a quick example of how a shift in behavior and a shift in thinking can help with the way that we feel. If you were to take a CBT class, the first thing that they typically would do is give you a list of what's called negative thinking patterns or cognitive distortions. And the goal really is to try to catch these and to see if you can just notice yourself doing them. So catastrophizing is certainly a big one for everybody. I always like to be mindful that these are all thought patterns that we all do, really. And really the benefit of knowing about them is working towards catching them so that we can shift away from them. So catastrophizing, of course, is big when we're anxious, like thinking about how bad something might be. Black and white thinking, so seeing things as all good or all bad. Shoulding is a big one, like I should be perfect, I shouldn't make a mistake, I should be the funniest person in the room. Magnification, minimization, so that's when we magnify the positive qualities in someone else and minimize our own positive qualities, like that person is amazing and I'm just not living up to expectations. So these are just a few examples, there's certainly more. But like with this model of therapy, what we want to really try to do is to catch these types of thoughts and to name them, like, okay, I'm catastrophizing right now, or maybe I'm shoulding right now. And then in turn, seeing if there's another way of viewing the situation. Like, is it as bad as I'm thinking? Or maybe it's okay to not be perfect all of the time. Yeah, and then like in this type of therapy, there's a tool called a thought record where you start to sort of challenge your thinking. And a major component of that is asking yourself these types of questions to help to shift your thinking. So have I had any experiences that show that this thought is not completely true all the time? Or if my best friend or someone I loved had this thought, what would I tell them? If my best friend or someone who loves me knew I was thinking this, what would they say to me? When I'm not feeling this way, do I think about this situation any differently, and how? Are there strengths or positives in me or the situation that I'm ignoring? Am I jumping to any conclusions? Am I blaming myself for something over which I do not have complete control? So just in terms of working on the skill of shifting our thinking, it can be useful to have these questions on hand and just like maybe ask yourself some of them and see if it's possible to work on viewing a situation in a different, sort of more helpful way. One thing I like to encourage people to be mindful over is it's not about seeing the world from rosy colored glasses, just because that's not realistic or necessarily helpful. But it is about trying to recognize that things like anxiety and sadness do impact the way that we think. So the goal really is to try to shift towards seeing things from a more balanced or clear-colored or objective perspective. Yeah, and then just some other quick ideas from a cognitive therapy standpoint. If you find that you worry a lot, there is a skill called worry time, which basically is just dedicating a bit of time during the day to your worries. So like from 1 to 1:15 in the afternoon, that's worry time. Outside of worry time, if a worry pops up, you write it down and say, okay, I'm not going to worry about this right now. I'm going to worry about this during my worry time. And then it's a good thing to try to practice mindfulness skills. So bring your mind to your breath, bring your mind to your 5 senses. Again, if a worry pops up, you write it down and say, okay, I'm not going to worry about this right now. I'm going to worry about it during my worry time. And then when worry time comes the next day, you can take a look at your worries, and it could be a problem-solving time if some of the worries are solvable, or it could be a time to practice acceptance over things that are maybe outside of your control. So again, like sort of easier said than done, that one on different occasions, depending on what's going on in our life. But ultimately, the idea is it's important to work on compartmentalizing our worries as opposed to allowing worries to just kind of run their course during the day. Problem solving is a big one. So oftentimes when we worry, our minds are thinking about all the bad things that potentially could happen. And it can often shift us away from solutions to our problems. And so if there are solutions to our problems, it's a really helpful thing to try to find them and to try to work on them. And certainly focusing on what you can do to cope with situations is important. Like we of course go through stressful things in our lives, and reminding ourselves of what we can do to cope with the stress is important. Distraction can often be good, like just really trying to work on getting the mind away from everything. Gratitude journaling, so just spending a little bit of time every day writing out things that you're grateful for. And then I often like to include the app called Woebot. It's a cute app, just this little robot avatar. And you log into Woebot, and Woebot will say, "Hi, Matt, how are you?" And then like I can write in, "Oh, I'm anxious," or "I'm sad." And then Woebot will say, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." It's a bit cheesy, but it actually is kind of useful. And then Woebot will say, "Do you want to just talk about it, or do you want to work on some cognitive strategies to challenge your thinking?" And so you can sort of have the option of just sort of writing about your feelings or working on challenging your thinking. Yeah, so I think those are the cognitive behavioral strategies that I wanted to mention. Yeah, maybe I'll just pause again just to see if there's any thoughts.
The comment you make about imagining what you might say to someone else, I think is really interesting, and underlines how easy it is to be more compassionate to others than to yourself. I'm not sure why that is. It seems very, I don't know, Protestant or something. A couple of comments in the chat about how it's so much easier to order pizza than go to the gym.
Yeah.
And the feeling of guilt about should go to the gym. And I recognize that there's sort of comments made in jest, but at the same time, sometimes it's so much easier to do the thing that's not helpful.
Yeah.
It takes less energy, emotionally, physically, less time. Are there ways that we can encourage ourselves to do the more helpful, constructive, productive thing?
Yeah, for sure. I think like one of the most important things is, well, like I think like I was about to say something else, but I'm changing my mind here. I think really the most important thing is sort of the support and encouragement part, like for our mental health, and also for us to kind of make healthy choices. Having connection and having support is really just so important. Like the more connected we feel, the more that we're able to make choices that are in line with like really whatever we're wanting for our lives. But then from there, like trying to make things easier, so trying to make the habit easier that you want to engage with is important. So like I live in a small 1-bedroom, and I have an exercise bike just over here. And that for me is an example of making something easier. Like I like to do other types of activity. I like to run, I like to swim, but sometimes the idea of going downstairs and going outside and going for a run, especially during the winter time, feels monumental, legitimately. And so the exercise bike over here is just one example that I have from my own home, where I have something I could do for exercise that's just, there's less barriers to engage with it. It's just a bit easier to do. The second thing that comes to mind is, as funny as this maybe sounds, letting go of the attachment to the outcome, and just focusing on more present moment experiences. So what I literally mean by that is that, again, like using the running example, if I think about running right now, I'm going to sit back down on the couch, because the idea of running is just so overwhelming. So I have to let go of the attachment to that outcome. But what I can commit to is putting my pants on. And then from there, I can commit to putting my shirt on. And then from there, I can commit to putting my jacket on. And it's a skill to practice, but at no point committing to the run, like just doing those smaller, tangible steps that do feel manageable to me. And then in my experiences with that technique personally, the majority of the time I will go for the run. Sometimes I will be fully dressed and then sit back down on the couch again. But just like taking those mini steps, we're essentially activating our nervous systems to be ready for the ultimate goal. And then from there, we can maybe get there.
So making the healthy choice, and by breaking it down into manageable bite-sized pieces.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like having compassion for yourself if you order the pizza. Like sometimes we need those days too. Like pizza's good. Yeah, like sometimes it is really hard to stay focused on those goals, and sometimes we just sort of legitimately need rest. Like we just need a break from everything. Yeah.
All of these strategies sound really helpful, but I can already hear myself going, being unable to identify those moments when I should be using a strategy. I guess that's part of that is practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay if you told me a bit more about that experience? Like, does anything come to mind for you around that?
Okay, here's an example. Sometimes I sleep poorly, and I wake up in the night, and then I get mad at myself for being awake and not being able to get back to sleep. And then it just becomes an exercise of being mad at myself for not being able to sleep, and knowing that the result of that is going to be tomorrow is going to be harder and shitty and
right.
And I obviously, as we're talking about it clearly and methodically here, what I should be doing in that moment is having a little self-compassion, breaking it down. What would make it better right now? What's the small thing I can do? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I'd be curious to tell you what I would encourage you to do from a cognitive behavioral standpoint and get your reaction to it. So according to CBT for sleep, when we're struggling with sleep, there's two sort of major interventions that we can try to engage with to help ourselves. The first is called sleep restriction. So if I was working very specifically with you on this, I would ask you to tell me how many average hours of sleep you get over the last couple of weeks. And then I would give you a wake up. Well, you would decide what your wake up time is. And then I would give you a time in bed from there. So like say you've slept 6 hours on average over the last couple of weeks per night, and you want to wake up at 7:30 a.m. Then time in bed is 1:30 a.m. And so I'm going to want you to stay up a bit later to build what we call your sleep drive, to in turn improve your quality of sleep. And then what we do is give you some time back over time, like after a bit of time of sort of building your sleep drive and improving your sleep quality, we give you some time back. So instead of 1:30, we're going to go to bed at 1:10, and then kind of continue to build some time back from there. And then the other major component is called stimulus control. And so the idea with that is that we can learn to associate our beds with being awake if we unconsciously if we just have organically, I should say, been awake in bed or in our bedrooms, like maybe worrying about things or planning things or feeling stressed out about things. And so with stimulus control, we want to try to shift our relationship to the bed by essentially limiting the amount of time that we're awake in bed. So if you're awake for like 15-20 minutes, then I would want for you to get up and to go and do something calming and relaxing, to, again, sort of build up the sleep drive to in turn return to bed when you're feeling ready to sleep. So those are the two sort of major intervention strategies. Is it okay if I ask for your reaction to them?
That all sounds kind of sensible, but my schedule is so erratic that creating some kind of structure to then treat incrementally feels like another challenge.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I guess ultimately, to sort of circle back to your original comment and question, yeah, I guess like I would encourage somebody to keep trying to bring themselves back to compassion. Like compassion in this circumstance would be, it's maybe not attainable to do the very specific strategies by the book, but sort of like, what are the things that you can do to normalize when we fall off track, because that certainly is a very normal thing. Like to normalize, okay, like I'm having these critical thoughts, these judgmental thoughts, maybe even to let yourself have them for a period of time. And then at a certain point, like if we're talking about mental health skill, we want to try to notice at a certain point, okay, like this way of thinking is maybe not helping me right now. So what is something that I can do to try to make a shift? And then I think, again, like around the connection part, like trying to be mindful to not have to do everything on your own. Dude, like it's so normal to struggle. It's so normal to have a hard time with change. And sometimes we need to connect with other people to help us to stay on track with things. So maybe over a period of time of struggle with sleep, if that's something that you experience, to check in with someone on it, like whether it be a friend or a family member, a therapist or a doctor, and try to.
Big conversation in rehearsal today.
Right, okay. Yeah, I guess sort of like trying, like even just the initial talking about things is us sort of taking a step in the direction of the shift that we maybe want to see in our lives. And then maybe the last thing I might mention around this concept is, in mental health, we talk about the recovery model, which means recognizing that like trying to go for recovered, like I guess trying to go for perfection, like getting the best night's sleep that you possibly can get, is sort of stressful and difficult. And whenever we're trying to work on anything, it often looks like this, like there's sort of ups and downs, and we want to really try to normalize the shift, like normalize when things are maybe a bit more challenging. Like I know you're talking about beating yourself up, and like we want to try to shift away from that and have compassion. And just continue to slowly, compassionately bring ourselves back to the goal that we have for ourselves.
Yeah, it's easy to start thinking that there's a way you're supposed to be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want, I guess one more thing that comes to mind is the concept of hopefulness too. Like even though this is maybe an abstract concept, for mental well-being, maintaining a sense of hopefulness is such an important thing, and trying to find ways to have hope or reasons to have hope is just like so useful. And I know that that's sort of an abstract thing, but it is something that's important to kind of hang on to, that things can get better from here.
We're kind of at the halfway point in terms of our time. Did you want to keep going with presentation for a little bit and then?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that works for me. Yeah, so the next thing is mindfulness, awareness of the present moment in an accepting and non-judgmental way. We could do a meditation now. Did you get a sense of what to do with that? Like, should I skip over that or do it now? Yeah.
I would say skip through some more of the information and then maybe come back to that.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about what to do when emotions are running high. So these are skills from dialectical behavior therapy, just a very skills-oriented type of therapy. There's acronyms for everything in this type of therapy. The first one is TIP. So that stands for temperature, intense exercise, and paced breathing. So what that means is if you're feeling really overwhelmed, using really cold temperature is something that can be effective. So that could mean holding ice cubes in your hands and holding them until they melt in your hands. It could be like putting an ice pack or like a bag of frozen vegetables up to your face and just feeling that. It could also be taking a really cold shower. So the cold temperature is one that's often easier said than done. I personally do not like cold at all. I have a very low tolerance for cold. But I do take cold showers sometimes if I'm feeling overwhelmed, because I actually do find it to be particularly effective. And some people even do it almost prophylactically. Like some people will take cold showers daily because it's something that helps to regulate one's emotions. Intense exercise is another one. So that means doing exercise so intensely that you can't really do it for a very long time, and you can't really think about anything else also while you're doing it because you're exercising so intensely. And then the breathing, once again. So paced breathing is about just taking slow, long, deep breaths, ideally inhaling and holding for a few moments and then exhaling longer than it took you to inhale. There's a technique called 4-7-8 breathing technique where you inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, and exhale for 8. For me personally, I like to just take a big inhale and hold it for a few moments and then just kind of slowly exhale from there. Distraction is often a really important one. So if you're feeling really overwhelmed with anything, just distracting away from it altogether can be really useful. And you can distract yourself with different things, like with chores or activities or sensations. But really, we want to keep distracting until we notice a reduction in the feeling that we're experiencing. And self-soothing is another good distress tolerance skill. So in dialectical behavior therapy, we actually encourage people to make a self-soothing kit. So sort of a box of items that are filled with things that are soothing to look at, soothing to listen to, soothing to touch and taste and smell. And the reason for the kit is that when we're feeling overwhelmed, it sometimes can be hard to think about what to do. And so if you have just sort of a kit available to you, you can go directly to the self-soothing kit and hopefully find something that will bring some relief from the feeling that you're experiencing. And then the big one, which is not an easy skill to practice, but a really important one, is to try to practice the skill of radical acceptance, which ultimately is about trying to radically accept the present moment just as it is in this moment. And it doesn't mean agreeing with our present moment if we don't like it. It doesn't mean approving of it, and it doesn't mean giving up. Really, what it means is trying to let go of the inner struggle and fight that we might be experiencing with the reality of the present moment. So when we say things to ourselves, like, it shouldn't be this way, or I hate this, I want things to be different. Like, those are statements that might be indicative of us maybe not being in a place of acceptance. And so we want to try to catch that. And there are some ways in which you can practice it. So the first way is to observe that you're questioning or fighting reality. So like if you catch yourself saying something like it shouldn't be this way or it should be different. And then we want to try to practice acceptance with the whole self. Like, one way that I find myself more able to bring myself to a place of acceptance is to sit by the water. I really find that just relaxing my body by being in nature is something that is really effective with bringing my mind to a place of acceptance. Like, our mental health very much lives in our bodies, and oftentimes without us even noticing it, we're really tense and carrying a lot of stress in the body. And so if we can do things to calm the body, it can help to calm the mind. Practicing what we call opposite action. So listing all the behaviors you would do if you did accept the reality of the present, and then acting as if you've accepted. So like a key example of that is if somebody is really struggling with a breakup. It's often hard to accept that. And so if we were to list behaviors you would do if you did accept, it would be things like deleting the phone number, or removing from social media, or not going to places if possible where you would see this person, and essentially really trying to act as if you really accepted that reality. And sometimes when we engage in behaviors that are around acceptance, it can help to bring our mind to that place. And then when it comes to acceptance, there's always emotions that come along for the ride. And so to help us to bring ourselves to a place of acceptance, we want to allow those emotions to arise and fall. And if you can accept your experience of emotion, eventually you can potentially experience a calmness from there.
Matt, what's willing hands?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So willing hands is just tilting the palms upwards and putting them on your lap. And the idea is that, like, actually, this is something that often can be useful to do, is to notice how you carry your body when you're feeling emotions. Like, it's quite common for our bodies to be more kind of caved in. And willing hands is about opening the body up. And sometimes when we open our bodies up, it can help to open our minds up to come to a place of acceptance. So like when we're practicing the skill of radical acceptance, like just tilting the palms upwards, like it essentially opens your chest and shoulders up. And so by opening the body, it potentially can help to open the mind. And then half smile is just gently tilting the lips upwards. So not a full smile, just a gentle half smile. And it's sort of a similar concept that when we're feeling really frustrated, we might carry the tension in our face. And so the half smile is about opening the face up.
And then I had a question about the kit, the compassion kit, right?
The self-soothing kit.
Self-soothing kit. I think there are a lot of people who have things in their self-soothing kit that are maybe not so useful. I'm thinking about substances in particular, that a lot of folks have a habit of using alcohol, tobacco, drugs, various things as a way of self-soothing. It's familiar, has become a habit, whatever. Yeah. Any thoughts or comments around that?
Yeah. I would want people to practice mindfulness around the way in which they engage with substances. Like with things like marijuana or alcohol, like there absolutely is a soothing effect to them, which is why people go to them. And so like I would never want to take that away from anyone. But I would want people to try to practice being honest with themselves and being mindful over how is this impacting me? Like, is it okay to have some alcohol or to use some marijuana to try to cope or to manage, or is it actually making things worse? Like, is it creating sort of more sadness or more anxiety? And if that's the case, then I would encourage somebody to try to move towards other types of techniques and strategies that could help, that are different. But compassion for sure needs to come up along the way with that. Like, it's totally common for people to, at one point, make a decision, I'm not going to use drugs or alcohol anymore, and then to go a period of time without, and then for something really stressful to happen, and then to go back to using drugs and alcohol. And that doesn't mean that it's over, that if you still want to continue to try to move towards reduction or abstinence, we can still do that. We just really want to have compassion for that moment where maybe you did use alcohol or marijuana, even if it's not necessarily what you're wanting for your life right now in this moment.
Thanks.
Yeah. So just maybe I'll talk a bit about some things that make us vulnerable to powerful emotions. So another acronym is PLEASE. It's a bit of a stretch, this one, because the author of this type of therapy used the first P and the L of physical to make the PL. But anyway, you want to treat physical illness. So just, if you're sick, it makes you vulnerable to powerful emotion. And that's like, whether it be sort of a viral or bacterial thing, or even like just a physical thing like pain. Like, pain has such an impact on our experiences with our mental health. And so we want to be able to treat our physical bodies as much as we can to help to feel as well as we can mentally. Balanced eating is really important. So trying to eat in a balanced way throughout the day and doing our best to avoid things that are high in sugar and high in fat. We want to avoid mood altering substances as much as possible. But again, like I really just want people to be mindful over their experience with drugs and alcohol. Like, how is it impacting you, and to try to make decisions in turn. We want to certainly try to get as balanced sleep as we can. Sleep absolutely is a vulnerability for our mood and anxiety. Like, the better we sleep, the better we feel. And then trying to get as much exercise as we possibly can. And there's just a little bit of information on some foods that can increase stress, like sugar, alcohol, excess caffeine, foods that are low in healthy carbohydrates. But of course, we want to be compassionate towards ourselves. Like, everybody, well, I mean, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people like sugar. Like, I would probably argue most people drink alcohol, most people have some caffeine. So again, we just want to sort of be mindful of our experiences with them and try to make intentional decisions from there. I drink a lot of caffeine, so for sure that's something that I could benefit from reducing a little bit. With alcohol, like, one thing I've noticed with myself is it's really changed at different points in my life, like how I tolerate alcohol. Like right now at this particular point in my life, I notice myself really being impacted by it. Like, I feel very lethargic and tired the next day, and even kind of sad. So I'm doing my best to avoid alcohol as much as possible. But I've had periods of time in my life where I could drink and like it was totally okay. So I guess around the mindfulness component, like just sort of recognizing that the way we tolerate certain foods and alcohol can shift and change at different points in our life. So just some ideas from a dietitian are to work on alcohol-free days. If you drink, to try to limit the quantities, to always have it with food and water, and red wine is the best choice, with 4 ounces being the magic pour. And carbohydrates absolutely can be good for calming, like on the complex carbohydrate end of the spectrum. Like, I actually often will have a little bit of bread before a presentation, and I find it to be quite good at bringing a calmness to me. I had a peanut butter banana sandwich before this, and it really helped. And there's this just cheesy cartoon. How do I know that my experience of consciousness is the same as other people's experiences of consciousness? What is my purpose? Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? These are the complex carbohydrates. It's very cheesy, but I think it's a funny cartoon. Cool. Yeah, and so I talked about this already, but like, these are just some rules to help with sleep: selecting a standard wake up time as best as you can, going to bed when you're sleepy, getting up when you can't sleep, not worrying or planning in bed, using the bed only for sleeping, and sex is the only exception to that rule. Avoid daytime napping, and don't watch the clock. Yeah, and then just some ideas to help to optimize your sleep environment, like limiting noise, lighting, like trying to make it as dark as possible. Our bodies really like cold for sleep, so like trying to be mindful over the room temperature, the air quality, the comfort of the bed, clothing choices, and electronics. And this again is where mindfulness can really come into play. Like, I've had sort of an interesting journey with sleep. Like, when I was younger, I had no problems with sleep whatsoever. And then as I've gotten older and experienced different stressors in my life, I have had periods of time where I've really struggled with insomnia. And then in more recent times, there's times where I notice myself being awake at night, times where I'm sleeping, and I try to practice mindfulness around it. And one thing that I really notice for myself is if I have a particularly messy or cluttered room, it causes some struggle with sleep. And so I really do notice that the cleaner I keep my space, the better that I'm sleeping. And then for sure, for me, like, the later I have caffeine, the more of an impact it's going to have over me. So we want to just sort of try to be mindful over these types of things and make decisions kind of in turn. I already went over the sleep restriction part. So if anybody wants to try it on their own, you just want to take your average amount of sleep over a 2-week period. And then if possible, I know like it's not always possible to get up at the same time every day, but if possible, give yourself a wake up time and then give yourself a time in bed that is the average amount of sleep that you've had over the last 2 weeks. So the example, if you're going to wake up at 7:30 and you've slept for 6 hours on average every night over the last 2 weeks, then we want you to go to bed at 1:30 and try that out for 2 weeks. And then after that, if you're sleeping for most of the time, you can give yourself some time back. Yeah, and so that's the sleep part. So I could talk a little bit about relationships if we wanted to. Maybe again, I'll just sort of pause and check in and maybe see what the vibe is. Like, should I keep talking or should we pause for questions? And
A question about exercise.
Yeah.
Any suggestions for physical exercise when you're so low that you don't feel like you have any energy? Like when you're, I guess, in that staying in bed phase. And
yeah.
any exercise seems like it's impossible.
Yeah, no, I would try to recommend really just the lowest barrier of entry, like whatever that looks like even if it means doing some physical activity in bed itself. And like you might even find that there are resources for that. I don't necessarily know off the top of my head, but I used to work at a community health center in Belleville, and they would do seated exercise programs that could be accessed online even. And so like they would teach just some exercise that you can do even in a seated position. And like ultimately what we want to try to do is focus on the step that feels attainable. Like it doesn't matter what it is. And we really want to practice self-compassion and non-judgmental, like in a non-judgmental approach towards ourselves. But we want to really try to focus on just what is the step that we actually could take, no matter how big or small it is, and then start from there. And certainly from a cognitive behavioral approach, the term is behavioral activation. So it's really about getting the ball rolling. We want to start with a step that is attainable and then work from there.
So for exercise to actually have an impact, does it need to be getting your heart rate up?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like it, so in order for exercise to sort of fully be antidepressant, like it's good for it to be cardiovascular and for it to be about 30 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. But sometimes we find that to be too challenging or too difficult or maybe even impossible. And so it's useful to just start wherever we're at. Really.
I can't remember who it is, but I did see somebody on the YouTube has got a series of yoga in bed, which
okay, yeah,
nice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so accessing those types of resources, and then yeah, as best as possible, trying to access support as well. Like with any kind of change or goal in our lives, doing things on our own is often very, very challenging and very difficult. And yeah, I think like we sort of live in a culture where we are encouraged to do things individually and on our own so often. And it's really just not human to do things on our own all the time. It's just such a human thing to need connection and to need support. And so I would say with any sort of goal or intention we might have in our lives, if possible, we want to access support around it.
We've got about 40 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we wanted to get through any more information or if you wanted to move to opening up the room more.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think I only have I don't have a ton more slides. So maybe if it's okay, I might just finish the presentation and then we can leave the remaining time for questions and answers.
Great.
Yeah. So relationships are a big part of our mental health. And I've just I'm just going to share some information again from dialectical behavior therapy on how we can work on improving our relationships. So according to this type of therapy, to be interpersonally effective, so to sort of get what we want out of relationships, we want to try to focus on being skillful in terms of getting what we want and need from others, about building relationships and ending harmful ones, and trying to balance acceptance and change in relationships. And so according to this type of therapy, we say there's three main priorities when it comes to our relationships. The first is objective. So like, are you trying to get something from this person? Are you trying to obtain a goal here? The second is your relationship with them. Like, is the goal to maintain positive relationships? Or is the last one your self-respect? Like, are you talking to this person to maintain or improve your self-respect? And any one or all of them can be a priority. The idea from this perspective is it can be useful before communicating to clarify within ourselves, what is the priority here exactly? And then in turn, there are sort of ways of speaking to keep in mind. So with objective, the acronym is MAN. So we want to be mindful over our goals. We want to appear confident, and potentially we want to negotiate. So the example in the book that they give is person A has a partner who's coming home late all the time, and person A wants their partner to call them or send them a text to let them know if they're going to be late. And so according to the mindful part, like, the partner is sort of resistant to making the call. And so to be mindful or keeping a focus on the goals, sometimes we want to be a broken record. Like, I understand it's tough, and I still want you to let me know that you're going to be late. I still want you to let me know that you're going to be late. So really being mindful is about being a broken record, like not veering off track and just bringing ourselves back to what we're wanting. Again, we want to sort of appear confident. So that's maybe using the willing hands or half smile and trying to maintain an open body posture. And then sometimes it can be useful to negotiate. So with the example, the person negotiates by asking for a text instead of a phone call. So like, not losing sight over what we want, but maybe lowering the offer a little bit to make it more attainable for the other person. Relationship, this one, I find this acronym to be pretty useful if you have anybody in your life who you care about, who you love, and you might not naturally be nice to them, as funny as that might sound. Like, sometimes we have people in our lives, family members oftentimes, who we maybe want to maintain healthy relationships with, but it might just be hard to be kind to them. And I actually do find this acronym to be useful. So we want to remind ourselves to be gentle. We want to remind ourselves to act interested in them, like ask questions, listen to them. We want to validate. Like, validation is such an important thing for our connections and for our relationships. And then we want to just kind of use an easy manner. And then probably the biggest one when it comes to mental health is honoring our self-respect. This one can be challenging for people, me included. Sometimes it's more natural to let go of our needs than it is to advocate for ourselves. And honoring our self-respect is really an important thing for our individual mental health, and also for the sake of our relationships. And so if you want to honor your self-respect with communication, it's important to be fair to ourselves and to other people. It's really important to not apologize. It's important to stick to your values, and it's important to be truthful. So a quick example I can give you around this is, several years ago, I had a roommate who, she was new to me. I had a roommate move out and 2 months left on the lease. So I interviewed somebody and brought her in for the last 2 months. And after a day or so, she asked if she could borrow my car to drive it to Algonquin. And it was, in my opinion, a big ask, but I said yes right away, because it's just what I did. It's just what the natural response was. And then I walked away, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I feel very uncomfortable about this. I don't like that she asked me that. I need to honor my self-respect here. And so I went back and I just said to her, you know, I actually feel really uncomfortable with this. So I'm going to have to say no. And I use this FAST acronym. Like, I didn't apologize for it. I stuck to my values. I thought I was being fair because I thought that the request was unfair. And then the truthful part was a big thing to remind myself of too, because just sort of naturally we might go to making up a lie. Like I started to think, okay, maybe I should tell her that I forgot I have a wedding out of town and I need to use my car. Like sometimes we do that, but I had to stop myself and just remind myself, just be truthful. Like it's enough to just say I'm uncomfortable and I'm going to say no. And the reason why I like to share this example is I'm quite confident that I would have resented her if I had let her take my car, and that would have been challenging to build a relationship with her. But because I honored my self-respect, I felt better about myself, which in turn actually made it easier to build a relationship with her. And we actually did have a good friendship while we lived with each other. Yeah, so in terms of mental health, I would probably argue that the self-respect one is probably the biggest one to be mindful over. And then here are just some positive thoughts that might be helpful to keep in mind when it comes to navigating relationships. Like, you have a right to need things from others. You have a right to put yourself first sometimes. You have a right to feel and express your emotions or your pain. You have a right to be the final judge of your beliefs and accept them as legitimate. You have the right to your opinions and convictions. You have the right to your experience, even if it's different from other people. You have a right to protest any treatment or criticism that feels bad to you. You have a right to negotiate for change. You have a right to ask for help, emotional support, or anything else you need, even if you might not always get it. You have a right to say no, and saying no doesn't make you bad or selfish. You have a right not to justify yourself to others. You have a right not to take responsibility for someone else's problem. You have a right to choose not to respond to a situation. And you have a right sometimes to inconvenience or disappoint others. That's often a big one that comes up in therapy. Like, oftentimes when it comes to sort of honoring our own needs, sometimes that inconveniences or disappoints other people. And reminding ourselves that we have the right to do that sometimes is, I would say, critical for maintaining our mental health in the context of relationships. Yeah, and so just quickly, if you're looking for a therapist, the main thing that I encourage people to keep in mind is what's called the therapeutic relationship. So there's so many different types of therapies, so many different types of therapists out there. And in terms of outcome related to therapy, according to research, even the most important factor is your therapeutic relationship, like feeling connected to the therapist, feeling like it's a safe environment to express your feelings and your needs, feeling like you can clarify things with the therapist. Like, if the therapist said or did anything that maybe didn't feel right to you, like being able to sort of bring that up and talking it through with the therapist, feeling like the way the therapist is working makes sense for you. Like, ultimately, the relationship is really the most important factor. And so if you're choosing a therapist, I would for sure recommend trying to do a few phone consultations. Most therapists will offer a free 15-minute phone consultation where you can just chat, get to know the person, see how you feel with them. Like, do you feel good with this particular person? And then kind of go from there. I know that's maybe still kind of a bit nebulous, but like, ultimately, really, it's about goodness of fit with the therapist that we want to pay the most attention to.
Matt, are there questions that one should pose when you're sort of trying to find a fit with a therapist, or is it just about a feeling?
There's definitely questions that you can ask for sure. I would really encourage paying attention to how you're feeling while you're talking to the person as a key guide. But questions that are very commonly asked are I guess I did one today, so maybe I should use that as an example. Like, usually when I do a phone consultation, I'll say, hey, this is just a good opportunity for us to get to know each other, like for you to get to know me, for me to get to know you, for you to see if you think it's a good fit. And then I'll always ask them, just in a nutshell, what are you looking for? Like in terms of therapy, like are there specific things you're wanting to talk about or specific things you're wanting to work on? And then usually a person will just sort of explain what's going on for them and what they're looking for. And common questions are like, do you have experience working with this? Or like, what would you do to help me in this situation? How do you feel about this connection? Like, do you feel like this would be a good fit for you? Yeah, there's definitely more questions. I could certainly try to find some. I know that there's writing online about like these types of questions, but those are just a few that immediately come to mind anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. And then just some resources that might be useful to check out. So like Bounce Back Ontario, for those that are in Ontario, is a free mental health resource. There's two that are Canada wide, Together All Canada, Wellness Together Canada. The Center for Clinical Interventions is a really good website that I like a lot that has free cognitive behavioral therapy workbooks on a variety of different topics, from depression to body image to self-esteem to self-compassion. Palouse Mindfulness is a free mindfulness-based stress reduction course. So if you're interested in doing mindfulness-based stress reduction, this website, I believe it's palouse-mindfulness.com, but even if you just Google Palouse Mindfulness, you'll find it. And yeah, so it's just like free audio recordings of a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. If you're in the Toronto area, the Alan Malka Green Artist Health Center is a clinic that is designed for the health and well-being of artists, and they have subsidies available to eligible artists to help to subsidize the cost of the care services there. Green Space is another Ontario resource, but if you're struggling to find a therapist that's a good fit for you, Green Space is a free service that helps to match you to therapists. And then there's different apps like Wobot, like I said, and Headspace is a mindfulness app. And there's certainly a ton more, but those are just a couple that you might want to check out. Yeah. So that's the end of the presentation. So we're at 3:34 now. So definitely open to questions or comments if anybody has any.
I will hand it back to Scott to wrap
That's
up.
great. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Matt and Deena, for this conversation. We know that mental health issues are really a big focus for many of our members, and I think having sessions like this is a really helpful way of distributing knowledge and resources and ideas, and just having those conversations that sometimes we don't really know where else to bring. So thank you both for facilitating this today. I just have a couple of closing pieces. I also want to thank our ASL interpreters, Amanda and Francine, for helping with provide accessibility. And this video will show up on the website, and it will also be posted to Equity's YouTube channel, at least the recorded portions of it. So if you're looking for the presentation, it will be there as well. Please don't forget to fill out the survey that will come to you if you attended. You'll be getting a note about a survey that will be very helpful for us. And thanks for attending. It's great when members turn out for these events, and the more people turn out, the more we will be prompted to keep creating new ones. I think that's it. On behalf of everybody over here at Equity, thanks for coming, and we'll see you again for the next one very soon. Take care for now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Matt.